secrets that sleep for decades, not because they are forgotten, but because the living are too afraid to wake them. Imagine this: a quiet American town, church bells, white fences, generations of families telling the same story about who they are and how their town was built. Now imagine a letter. Not an ordinary letter. A letter sealed with black wax, locked in a cedar box, hidden beneath municipal records, and written with a single command: do not open this until everyone who lived in this town during my lifetime is dead. Think about that for a moment. Not 10 years, not 20. Everyone. Every witness, every accomplice, every silent observer, gone. The man who wrote those words understood something most people never will: that truth is not just dangerous in the present. Sometimes the present is the most dangerous place for truth to exist, because the people who benefit from lies are still alive. His name was Edmund Farrow. He was not a politician. He was not a preacher. He was not a revolutionary. He was something far more unsettling. He was the man who kept the records. For decades he watched quietly from the background of Harlow, Virginia. He handled its money. He reviewed its property deeds. He studied its land surveys. He listened when powerful families spoke in confident voices about honor, legacy, and the proud history of the town they had built. And the longer he watched, the more the numbers stopped making sense. Land that changed hands without explanation. Witnesses who appeared on documents but nowhere else in history. Names that surfaced in one record and vanished from every other record ever written. At first, they looked like small errors, clerical mistakes, nothing unusual in a young town built on the chaotic frontier of early America. But Edmund Farrow had a habit that made powerful men uncomfortable. He compared things. Ledgers against ledgers, deeds against surveys, names against church records, and slowly, methodically, the illusion began to crack. What he discovered was not just corruption. It was something darker, a pattern of silence stretching back to the very founding of the town. Land that had been taken, people who had disappeared, and families who had grown powerful because those disappearances were never questioned. Edmund Farrow realized something terrible. Harlow's story, the one its citizens proudly told their children, was not history. It was a carefully maintained lie. But he also understood another truth, the most dangerous truth of all. If he exposed it while those families still lived, he would be destroyed. So instead, he did something far more patient. He wrote everything down, every document, every discrepancy, every missing person whose absence had quietly built the town's wealth. 7 pages, cold, precise, methodical. And then he sealed them away with instructions that ensured no one alive could stop the truth from one day breathing. 91 years later, the wax finally broke, and the town of Harlow would learn something every society eventually learns. Some truths don't stay buried. They wait. And when they finally rise, they do not just expose the past. They destroy the story people believed about themselves. To understand why Edmund Farrow sealed that letter, you must first understand the kind of man he was. Because history often hides its most dangerous observers in plain sight. Farrow was not the loudest man in Harlow, not the richest, not the most powerful. But he possessed something that made powerful men nervous. He paid attention. Born in 1798 on a modest tobacco farm just outside what would later become the town limits, Edmund grew up in a world that rewarded strength, charm, and ambition. He had none of those things in the way other men understood them. What he had instead was memory, a frighteningly precise one. As a boy, he carried a small notebook everywhere he went. While other children chased horses through fields or wrestled in the dust outside the churchyard, Edmund would stop mid-step to write something down. A fence line that had moved, a wagon that arrived late at night and left before dawn, a neighbor suddenly repairing a roof he had claimed for years he could not afford to fix. His mother once asked him why he wrote so many things. The boy answered with a sentence that, in hindsight, feels almost prophetic. Because people forget what they did yesterday. It seemed harmless at the time, but men who build their power on quiet arrangements understand something most people never think about. Memory is dangerous, and written memory is even worse. When Edmund was 21, his father died unexpectedly and left him the small farm and a modest debt. Most young men would have struggled. Pharaoh did not. He paid off the debt in 3 years, not by growing more tobacco, but by doing something far more unusual for a young farmer. He began lending money. Carefully, quietly, fair terms, exact records, precise repayment dates. Within a decade, nearly every family in Harlow had borrowed money from him at least once, which meant something else was happening beneath the surface. Edmund Pharaoh was seeing the inside of every household's finances. He knew who was rising. He knew who was drowning in debt. He knew which families looked wealthy in public, but were secretly surviving on borrowed time. By 1830, he was serving on the town council, not as mayor, not as a public speaker, but as the clerk, the keeper of records, the man who handled ledgers. And that was exactly where Edmund Pharaoh wanted to be. Power without visibility, influence without attention. Because from that position, he could see something no one else could see. The entire structure of the town. Every land transfer, every tax payment, every mortgage, every quiet agreement made between families that later pretended the agreement had never happened. Most people think corruption is loud. It isn't. Real corruption is quiet. It lives in paperwork. It hides in legal language. It grows slowly through decades of transactions that each look harmless on their own. But when someone like Edmund Pharaoh compares them all together, a pattern begins to emerge. And by the late 1830s, that pattern had begun to bother him. Land surveys that didn't match property lines, witness signatures belonging to people who never appeared in church records, property deeds transferring acres of farmland from individuals whose names simply vanished afterward. At first, he told himself what every careful man tells himself: coincidence, clerical mistakes, incomplete records. But then something happened that changed the direction of Edmund Pharaoh's life forever. A woman died. Her name was Ruth Patton, and with her death, the quiet observer of Harlow would begin digging into its past in a way no one in the town was prepared for. Ruth Patton was the only person in Harlow who seemed to truly understand Edmund Pharaoh. Not in the way gossiping townspeople like to imagine. Not romance, not scandal, not whispered secrets behind closed doors. It was something rarer than that. Recognition. They had grown up less than a mile apart, children attending the same small church, walking the same dusty roads between farms, sitting through the same long sermons that stretched across slow Virginia Sundays. But while other children forgot those days, Edmund remembered everything, and Ruth noticed that he remembered. She was sharp in a way most people underestimated, quiet, observant, the kind of woman who listened longer than she spoke. Her husband, George Patton, owned a dry goods store in town and had the kind of loud personality that filled every room he entered. George was liked by everyone. Ruth was understood by almost no one, except Edmund. Over the years, their conversations became something unusual for a small American town in the early 1800s. They spoke about land records, family histories, the strange way certain names appeared everywhere in the town's documents. Ruth had a talent for asking the kinds of questions most people avoid, questions that make comfortable stories feel unstable. "Have you ever noticed," she once asked him, "how some families in this town seem to grow richer every decade, even when the economy around them struggles?" Edmund had noticed. He had noticed for years. But hearing someone else say it out loud did something strange inside him. It made the thought real, because until that moment, his observations had been private calculations, numbers and ledgers, signatures on deeds, quiet inconsistencies that might still be explained by chance. But Ruth saw the pattern too, and once two people see the same pattern, it becomes much harder to dismiss. For 30 years, their friendship continued like this. Quiet conversations after church, occasional visits when Edmund stopped by the Patton store to review invoices or discuss business matters. Nothing dramatic, nothing scandalous, just two people watching the town around them with a level of awareness that made other people slightly uncomfortable. Then, in the autumn of 1843, a fever swept through Harlow. Small towns in that era lived under the constant shadow of illness. One season of sickness could erase families overnight. 11 people died that autumn. One of them was Ruth Patton. Edmund Farrow was sitting beside her bed when she took her last breath, and something changed inside him that day. For the first time in decades, the quiet observer stopped attending council meetings. He stayed inside his house for nearly 3 weeks. No one knew what he was doing, but when he finally returned to public life, people noticed something subtle had shifted. He looked the same dark coat, same calm voice, same careful way of speaking, but the patience that had defined him for most of his life had hardened into something else: purpose. Over the next 2 years, Edmund Farrow began doing something no one in Harlow had ever seen before. He started digging into the town's past. Not casually, not out of curiosity, but with the focus of a man who believes he is about to uncover something dangerous. He requested old land grants from the county courthouse. He studied surveys from the 1790s. He compared deeds that had been signed decades earlier by men who were long dead. People saw him walking along property lines with folded maps in his coat pocket, measuring distances, comparing boundaries. When asked what he was doing, he always gave the same simple answer: audit of the town records. It sounded harmless, but the truth was something else entirely. Because by the end of those 2 years, Edmund Farrow had discovered something that made him realize one horrifying truth. Harlow wasn't just built on land, it was built on disappearances. At first, the disappearances looked like accidents. That is how history often hides its darkest moments. A traveler who passed through town and was never seen again. A farmhand who moved west without telling anyone. A widow who supposedly sold her land and left during the winter, though no one remembered seeing the wagon she used to leave. Individually, these stories sounded normal. Frontier towns in early America were filled with people arriving and leaving every season. Records were imperfect, communication was slow. People vanished from communities all the time. But Edmund Farrow was not studying one story. He was studying dozens. And when he placed those stories side by side, something deeply disturbing began to emerge. Each disappearance was followed by the same thing: land transfers. Not years later, not after long legal battles or disputes, sometimes within weeks. property deeds quietly shifting ownership into the hands of a small group of families whose names appeared again and again in the town's records. The Caldwell family, the Harrows, the Dentons, the Whitlocks. 4 families, 4 names that seemed to sit quietly at the center of Harlow's wealth. Edmund began mapping the transfers on a large sheet of paper spread across his study table. Each farm, each acre, each disappearance. By the winter of 1846, the map looked less like coincidence and more like a strategy. A slow expansion of land, farm by farm, field by field, always moving outward from the original town center, always ending with the same signatures on the final deeds. It was too clean, too consistent, too deliberate. But the most disturbing discovery came when Edmund examined the earliest land records in the county courthouse. The documents dated back to the late 1700s, when Harlow was still nothing more than a small settlement surrounded by dense forests. According to the official records, the founding families had purchased their land legally, signed agreements, witnessed transactions, perfectly legitimate. But Edmund noticed something strange: the witnesses. Many of the land transfers listed the same 3 witnesses over and over again. 3 men whose signatures appeared on dozens of early deeds. But when Edmund searched church registries, tax rolls, and census lists, those men did not exist. No births, no burials, no property, no taxes, no record of them ever living in the town. Yet their signatures had helped legally transfer hundreds of acres into the hands of Harlow's most powerful families. It was a clever trick, almost invisible, because once a deed was signed and recorded, the land became legally owned, and once decades passed, no one thought to question it, except Edmund Farrow. For weeks he sat in his study, surrounded by documents and maps, staring at the pattern forming across the town's history. And slowly, a possibility began forming in his mind. A possibility so disturbing he struggled to even write it down. What if the disappearances were not accidents? What if the witnesses were not real? What if the founding families of Harlow had built their wealth the simplest way possible, by removing the people who stood in their way? It was a thought that could destroy reputations, destroy families, destroy the entire story the town believed about itself. But Edmund Farrow knew something else. If the pattern was real, there would be proof. And proof has a way of surviving long after the people who created it are gone. So in the spring of 1847, he made a decision that would quietly set the stage for the letter that would not be opened for 98 years. He began investigating the disappearances themselves, not through records, but through the land. Most people think the past lives in document, but Edmund Farrow understood something different. The past lives in the ground. Paper can be rewritten, records can disappear, stories can be changed, but the earth remembers. In the spring of 1847, Edmund began walking the outer farms of Harlow with a purpose that no one fully understood. At first, the townspeople assumed he was doing what he had claimed, verifying property boundaries. As town clerk, it was not unusual for him to inspect land lines or review survey markers. But the places he chose to visit told a different story. He was not inspecting the wealthy farms owned by the 4 powerful families. He was walking the edges, the narrow fields, the older plots, the places that had changed ownership many times across the decades. Farmers often noticed him standing silently at the edge of a field, studying the ground as if something beneath it was speaking to him. Sometimes he carried a metal rod used by surveyors, sometimes only a small notebook. One farmer, a man named Samuel Reed, later recalled something strange about those visits. Edmund rarely asked questions. Instead, he listened. Old farmers like Reed loved to talk about the history of their land, who had owned it before them, what had once stood where a barn now sat, which fields had once been forests. Most people ignored these rambling stories. Edmund wrote them down. He asked about abandoned wells, about barns that had been torn down decades earlier, about fields where crops never seemed to grow properly. Small things, but small things repeated often enough form patterns. And the pattern Edmund began to notice pointed him toward one specific area of land, a stretch of woodland just outside town, known locally as Cedar Hollow. It was not valuable farmland. The soil was rocky, the ground uneven. Farmers avoided building there, which made it perfect for something else. When Edmund examined the earliest maps of Harlow, Cedar Hollow appeared again and again as a reference point in land surveys, almost like a reference point, a place surveyors always mentioned but no one ever developed. That alone would not have meant much, but when he compared the map of Cedar Hollow to the disappearances he had been tracking, something disturbing happened. Several of the missing individuals had owned property that bordered the hollow, and within a year of their disappearances, those properties had been transferred to the same families Edmund had been watching for months: Caldwell, Harrows, Denton, Whitlock. It was too consistent to ignore, so one cool morning in October of 1847, Edmund Farrow walked into Cedar Hollow alone. The forest there was older than the town itself. Tall cedar trees blocked much of the sunlight, leaving the ground beneath them strangely quiet. He spent nearly 6 hours walking through that hollow, measuring distances, studying the slope of the land, stopping occasionally to push his metal rod into the soil, testing the firmness of the earth. By late afternoon, he reached a small clearing that did not appear on any survey map. It was subtle, barely noticeable unless someone was looking closely. The ground in the center of the clearing had sunk slightly, forming a shallow depression no larger than a wagon, and the grass growing over it looked younger than the rest of the forest floor. Edmund stood there for a long time, long enough that the sun began to dip behind the trees, because in that moment a realization was slowly settling into his mind. If he was right about what he had discovered, then Cedar Hollow was not just part of Harlow's history. It was where that history had been buried, and digging any deeper would mean uncovering something the most powerful families in the town had spent generations making sure no one would ever find.
Edmund Farrow did not start digging that day. A reckless man might have. A curious man definitely would have. But Edmund had never been either of those things. He was patient, and patience had kept him alive in a town where powerful families quietly controlled land, money, and influence. So instead of returning with a shovel, he returned with questions. For the next several weeks, Edmund began doing something very careful. He stopped talking about records. He stopped asking about property lines. Instead, he asked the oldest people in Harlow about stories. Not official history, not the proud version of the town's past told at church gatherings or town celebrations. He wanted the small stories, the strange ones, the ones people told late at night and then laughed off as imagination. At first, the answers sounded harmless. Hunters spoke about animals avoiding Cedar Hollow. Children claimed they sometimes heard sounds in the forest after dark. One elderly woman remembered her grandmother warning her never to walk through the hollow alone. But the most important story came from a man who had lived longer than almost anyone else in Harlow. His name was Thomas Bell. He was 86 years old, nearly blind, and spent most of his days sitting on the porch of his son's house watching the road. When Edmund asked him about Cedar Hollow, the old man did something strange. He grew quiet. Then he said something that made Edmund's heart beat a little faster. "There used to be a road there." Edmund leaned closer. "A road?" Bell nodded slowly. "A road. Before the town grew, before the big farms. Wagons used to pass through that hollow on the way west. That alone was not unusual. Many early roads disappeared as towns expanded, but Bell continued speaking, and sometimes the wagons didn't come back." Edmund asked the obvious question. "Bandits?" The old man shook his head. "No." His voice lowered slightly. "People said the road was safe, too safe. No robberies, no broken wagons, no bodies." Then he looked directly at Edmund with cloudy eyes. "But travelers still vanished." Bell claimed his own father had once warned him about the road, not because of criminals, but because of the men who controlled the land around it. Families who arrived in Harlow early, families who were already wealthy when the town was still struggling to survive. Caldwell, Harrows, Denton, Whitlock, the same 4 names Edmund had seen over and over again in his records. Bell leaned back in his chair after telling the story, as if the memory had drained his energy. Before Edmund left, the old man added one final sentence, a sentence that would echo in Edmund's mind for the rest of his life. "They said travelers who carried money sometimes never made it past Cedar Hollow." For the first time since beginning his investigation, Edmund Farrow felt something he had been carefully avoiding: fear. Because if the stories were true, then Cedar Hollow was not simply a burial ground. It was something worse. It was the quiet intersection where the town's earliest wealth may have been built. And if powerful families had once used that hollow to make people disappear, then uncovering the truth would not just expose the past, it might expose something those families were still willing to protect. For several nights after speaking with Thomas Bell, Edmund Farrow barely slept. The old man's story had confirmed something Edmund had been trying to avoid believing. The pattern in the records, the disappearances, the land transfers, and now the forgotten road through Cedar Hollow. Each piece fit together too neatly, but suspicion was not proof, and Edmund Farrow understood something better than anyone in Harlow. Without proof, the powerful remain untouchable. So in November of 1847, he returned to Cedar Hollow. This time he did not go alone, but he also did not bring anyone from Harlow. Instead, he hired 2 laborers from a nearby county, men who had never heard of the town's founding families and had no reason to fear them. To them, it was simple work: dig a test trench, 2 feet deep, maybe 3. Edmund told them he was verifying an old survey marker, nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. The men began digging in the shallow depression Edmund had discovered weeks earlier. For the first hour, nothing happened, just dirt, roots, loose stones. But then the sound changed. Instead of the dull thud of metal against soil, the shovel struck something harder. One of the laborers knelt down and brushed the dirt away. At first it looked like an old tree root, curved, pale, partially buried in the earth. Then the man suddenly pulled his hand back, because the shape was not a root, it was a bone, a human bone. For a long moment no one spoke. The laborer looked up at Edmund with the expression people get when an ordinary job suddenly becomes something else entirely. "Sir, you didn't say this was a grave." Edmund felt a slow chill move through him, because graves usually have markers, crosses, stones, something that tells the living who rests beneath the soil. But the clearing in Cedar Hollow had none of those things. Still, he forced himself to remain calm. "Keep digging," he said quietly. The second shovel strike uncovered another bone, then another. Within 20 minutes, the men had uncovered something far worse than a forgotten grave. They had uncovered a pile,
Skulls, ribs, broken arm bones tangled together beneath the soil, not arranged carefully, not buried respectfully, just thrown into the earth and covered quickly. One of the laborers stood up slowly, his face pale. "How many people is this?" Edmund didn't answer, because as he stared at the exposed bones, he realized something even more disturbing. Some of the bones were smaller, much smaller, not adults, children. For the first time since beginning his investigation, Edmund Farrow understood the true scale of what he had uncovered. This wasn't a single murder. It wasn't even a small group of killings. Cedar Hollow was something else entirely, a mass grave. And if his records were correct, those bones might represent decades of disappearances quietly erased from the town's history. But the most dangerous part of the discovery had not even happened yet, because news travels quickly in small towns. And by the time Edmund Farrow returned to Harlow that evening, someone had already told the Caldwell family that digging had begun in Cedar Hollow. The Caldwell house sat on the highest hill overlooking Harlow. It had been built there deliberately. From the front porch, a man could see the entire town, the church steeple, the market road, the river bend where traders once arrived with wagons full of goods. Power likes high ground, and the Caldwell family had enjoyed that view for nearly 60 years. When Edmund Farrow returned from Cedar Hollow that evening, he had barely stepped inside his house before there was a knock at the door. 3 slow knocks, not hurried, not nervous, confident. Edmund already knew who it would be. When he opened the door, he found Charles Caldwell standing on the porch. Charles was not the oldest member of the Caldwell family, but he was the one most people in Harlow considered its real leader. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark coat tailored better than anything most farmers in the town could afford. And behind him, 2 other men, one from the Harrow family, one from the Dentons. The 3 names Edmund had spent months tracing through land records were now standing quietly in front of him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Caldwell smiled. It was the kind of polite smile wealthy men use when they are pretending something is still a friendly conversation. "Evening, Mr. Farrow." Edmund nodded. "Evening." Caldwell glanced briefly toward the road, then back at Edmund. "We heard you've been doing some digging lately." The sentence sounded casual, but the message inside it was unmistakable. They knew. Not about the bones specifically, not yet, but they knew he had been investigating Cedar Hollow. Edmund kept his voice steady. "Survey work." Caldwell's smile widened slightly. "Of course." He stepped forward just enough that the lantern light from inside the house illuminated his face. Then he said something that would stay in Edmund's memory forever. "Some things in a town's past are better left where they are." The words hung in the air for several seconds. A warning, not shouted, not spoken with anger, just stated. Edmund could feel the weight of what he had discovered pressing against that moment. The bones, the disappearances, the decades of quiet land transfers. He realized something with sudden clarity. The family standing on his porch might not know exactly what he had found, but they knew enough to be afraid. And powerful men who are afraid of the truth rarely allow the truth to survive. Caldwell placed a hand gently on the porch railing. "Mr. Farrow," he said calmly, "you've done good work for this town for many years." Then he added a second sentence, one that was not a compliment. "It would be unfortunate if your reputation were damaged by misunderstandings." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Edmund understood exactly what they were offering. Forget Cedar Hollow. Stop asking questions. Let the past remain buried. In return, his life in Harlow would continue peacefully. If he refused, well, small towns had ways of dealing with troublesome people. Accidents, fires, disgrace. people leaving town suddenly, just like the ones he had been investigating. For a long moment, Edmund Farrow said nothing. Then he did something the three men on his porch did not expect. He nodded. "I understand." Caldwell studied his face carefully, trying to read something behind the calm expression. Finally, after a few seconds, he gave a satisfied smile. "Good." The three men turned and walked back down the hill into the darkness. But as Edmund closed the door behind them, his mind was already racing. Because the visit had confirmed something he had begun to suspect. The families of Harlow would never allow the truth about Cedar Hollow to be exposed, not while they were alive. Which meant Edmund Farrow had only one real option left. If he wanted the truth to survive, he would have to make sure it was discovered after everyone involved was gone. For the next several months, Edmund Farrow behaved exactly the way the Caldwell family hoped he would. He stopped visiting Cedar Hollow. He stopped asking questions about old land records. He attended town council meetings again, quietly recording taxes and property transfers, just as he had done for decades. From the outside, it looked like the warning had worked. People in Harlow slowly lost interest in his strange investigation. Even the laborers who had helped dig in the clearing were paid well and sent back to their own county, carrying only a vague story about finding old bones in the woods. To the powerful families of the town, the situation seemed resolved. But Edmund Farrow had not stopped. He had simply changed how he worked. Instead of digging in the ground, he began digging through time. Late at night, a single candle burned in the window of his study while he assembled everything he had discovered. The disappearances, the false witnesses, the land transfers, the bones in Cedar Hollow. He wrote slowly and carefully, building the story piece by piece, like a puzzle that could only be understood when every fragment was placed in exactly the right order. 7 pages. That was all it took. 7 pages of dates, names, maps, and observations. He never accused anyone directly. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke clearly enough. If someone in the future followed the trail he had documented, they would see exactly what he had seen. But Edmund also knew something important. Evidence is useless if the wrong people find it first. If the Caldwell family discovered what he was writing, the pages would vanish before anyone else ever read them. So he designed something clever. Instead of hiding the letter in his house, he arranged for it to be sealed inside the town's official archive records. A cedar box, locked, stamped with the seal of the town clerk's office, and attached to it a written instruction. This document is not to be opened until every citizen of Harlow living during the year of its writing is deceased. It was an unusual request, but in 1848, people respected formal documents and sealed instructions in ways that seem strange today. The box was placed among hundreds of other records that few people ever looked at, and Edmund Farrow returned to his quiet life. He never mentioned Cedar Hollow again. He never spoke about the bones. He never told anyone what he had written. In fact, to the outside world, the investigation seemed to have simply disappeared. But one person in Harlow still suspected something: Charles Caldwell. Powerful men rarely forget a threat to their legacy, and Caldwell understood Edmund Farrow better than most people in town. He knew the clerk was patient, careful, quiet, the kind of man who did not give up easily. Which meant there was still one question lingering in Caldwell's mind. Had Edmund Farrow truly stopped his investigation, or had he simply hidden it somewhere the Caldwell family could not reach? It was a question that would haunt the most powerful families of Harlow for decades. Because 91 years later, someone would finally open the cedar box, and everything Edmund Farrow had written inside would begin to unravel the carefully protected history of the town. Edmund Farrow died quietly in the winter of 1852. There was no scandal, no sudden disappearance, no mysterious accident. Just a slow illness that kept him in bed for several weeks before the town doctor finally admitted there was nothing more he could do. On a cold January morning, the clerk who had spent most of his life watching Harlow from the background took his final breath. His funeral was small, respectful, the kind of service given to a man who had lived a calm and responsible life. Town officials attended. Farmers came out of courtesy. Even members of the Caldwell and Whitlock families stood near the back of the church. To them, Edmund Farrow had been an inconvenience, but not a threat anymore, because whatever questions he had once been asking had died with him, or so they believed. Life in Harlow continued exactly as it always had. The Caldwell farms grew larger. The Harrows expanded their trading business. The Dentons began investing in new rail lines that were slowly pushing across Virginia during the late 1800s. Generation after generation passed. Children grew up hearing the same proud story about the founding families who had built the town through hard work and determination. Cedar Hollow slowly became just another patch of forest. The clearing where Edmund had uncovered the bones disappeared beneath decades of leaves and new tree growth. And the cedar box containing his 7 pages of careful observations gathered dust inside the town archive. For nearly a century, no one touched it. But time is patient, and by the late 1930s, something had quietly changed. Everyone who had been alive in 1848 was gone. Every witness, every accomplice, every person who might have understood the danger hidden inside that sealed box, which meant the condition Edmund Farrow had written in his instructions had finally been fulfilled. In the spring of 1939, the Town Council of Harlow began organizing old records to move them into a newly built municipal building. During that process, a young clerk named Daniel Mercer came across something unusual. A cedar box, locked, with a faded label attached to the lid. Mercer brushed dust from the paper and read the instruction written in careful handwriting. Do not open until all living citizens of Harlow at the time of its writing are deceased. The date on the document read 1848. Mercer laughed softly to himself. 91 years. Whatever secret had once been inside that box, it surely couldn't matter anymore. So he brought it to the council chamber, where several officials were reviewing old documents. One of them found the key that matched the small brass lock. The lid opened with a dry creak. Inside were 7 folded pages, yellow with age, but perfectly preserved. At first, the council members read silently. Then one man cleared his throat. Another leaned closer to the table. By the time they reached the final page, the room had become completely quiet. Because the letter didn't just tell a story about the past. It contained maps, dates, names, and a location: Cedar Hollow. Edmund Farrow had not written accusations, he had written directions. And within 2 weeks, the town of Harlow would begin digging in Cedar Hollow again. What they uncovered there would force the entire community to confront a truth that had been waiting underground for nearly a century. When Daniel Mercer finished reading the final page of Edmund Farrow's letter, the council chamber stayed silent for nearly a full minute. 7 men sat around the table, All of them descendants of families who had lived in Harlow for generations. All of them staring at the same sentence written at the bottom of the final page. Cedar Hollow contains the proof. Now imagine you are one of those council members. You've just read a document suggesting that the founding families of your town might have built their wealth through disappearances and secret burials. Think about this situation. If you announce this publicly, the town's entire reputation could collapse. But if you ignore it, and the letter is true, then dozens of victims remain buried in the woods. So here's the key moment. One council member finally spoke. "It's probably nothing." Another replied quietly, "Then we verify that." Not publicly, not with the town watching. They made a careful decision. They would investigate quietly first. A small team, a controlled dig, no announcements. Before we go further, I want you to think again like a detective. If they go to Cedar Hollow to check the location Edmund described, what is the single piece of evidence that would instantly prove the letter is real? Think about it for a moment. What would they need to find in the ground to confirm Edmund Farrow was telling the truth?